Good morning. As you know, we're living through some very interesting times these days. A lot of the things you're used to being able to visit and go to aren't open. And that's no different for some of these establishments here in downtown Guelph. This is the Albion Hotel. In 1916, the federal government of Canada passed a ban on public drinking and the sale of alcohol, which meant businesses like this had a lot of their revenue dry up. Now, Guelph has a very long history of brewing and distilling alcohol. When the Temperance Act was introduced in 1916, it affects the businesses of some of the largest distillers in the region, most notably the Sleeman family, and we'll get to them in a minute. Now, the story of the Sleemans is well known to the people here of Guelph. In fact, the Sleemans have marketed this to quite a degree of success, playing up their history of bootlegging. There's not a lot of documentation, though, to back up or substantiate those claims. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't happen. When you're engaged in illegal activity like bootlegging, you may not keep a record. In fact, in 1926, that's exactly what happened when the Sleemans are called to testify for the investigation into the custom and excise scandal that was going on in Ontario. Custom officials seem to be taking bribes, and the places that had the least amount of customer duty that was being collected on goods crossing the border were places like Niagara Falls, Windsor, Sarnia, and Sault Ste. Marie, all border towns here in Ontario. Now, the original Sleeman's distillery is right here at the Spring Mill, opened in 1830. Now, Sleeman's had already been caught and fined for producing alcohol that was greater than 2.5%. Under the temperance laws, you were allowed to produce alcohol that was only 2.5% so long as it was for medicinal purposes. A doctor could prescribe someone alcohol to ail their nerves. So at the custom and excise trial, the Sleemans are asked to show their books, and they can't. John Sleeman says he's lost them. He doesn't know where they've been. The company actually ceased production in 1926, so there was no books for the 1926-1927 year. And about a month after the trial, he sells the brewery to Holiday Brewery, and they run the brewery until 1933, where they finally close it. Now, the Sleemans are often talked about in the same breath as Al Capone when you're talking about the history of Guelph. Now, that could be true. It's just very, very difficult to substantiate. There was a driver from Minnesota who had once told the Sleeman rep that he used to drive for Sleeman's back in the 20s and deliver alcohol to Chicago for Capone. But that person has passed away, and the story is, at this point, impossible to substantiate. Another very likely scenario is that Sleemans were connected with Rocco Perry, who had connections to the city and was known to be the #1 bootlegger here in southern Ontario. And this brings us to Alice Street in Guelph, one of the most storied streets in the city. Alice Street is the heart of the ward. And the ward is where the Italian community settled in the early part of the 20th century. Now, the Italians had a culture of winemaking and brewing that pre-existed the Temperance Act of 1916. So when alcohol becomes illegal for public consumption and for sale in Ontario, that doesn't really disrupt the flow of this community. And so this becomes the setting of some of Guelph's most scandalous stories of bootlegging from the Prohibition years. Now, the biggest bootlegger in Ontario is a guy by the name of Rocco Perry. He's actually from Hamilton, St. Catharines area, bounces back and forth between those two cities. But he does have some connections here in Guelph. In 1913, he's part of a murder trial for Michael Fazzari. Michael Fazzari had gone out drinking that night with his uncle Michel and a couple other men, including Rocco Perry. And altercation breaks out between him and this guy called Joe Veroni, who was a very powerful and influential man in the ward. He was considered the mob leader here in Guelph's Little Italy. And so Fazzari is kind of called out as a chicken by Baroni, and so Fazzari is pulled away by his uncle, dragged into the house, and Fazzari emerges with a gun and he shoots Joe Baroni. He gets him in the face, just by the jaw, and he gets him in the arm. He doesn't kill him, but he does wound him. Now, an altercation breaks out. Fazzari takes off. Rocco Perri is seen shooting down the street at Fazzari. Fazzari is hit with a bullet, and he dies 4 days later in hospital. Now, when his trial rolls around, his uncle Michel, who had already given a statement to police saying that he saw Rocco Perri shoot him, suddenly can't remember the details of the story. He feels that he was too intoxicated and he couldn't remember what actually took place that night. And Rocco Perri ends up with this alibi. He's asleep at home. He was so drunk after coming back from downtown that he had passed out at some other person's house. So interesting set of circumstances or twist of events, but that's not where the Rocco Perri story ends. So here in 1912, 1913, it appears that Perri and Baroni might be associates. Now, something happens in the years that pass where Perri eclipses Baroni in importance. Baroni here, during the temperance movement, was considered the booze king of Guelph. But by 1922, someone has shot him and thrown him out of a moving vehicle in Niagara Falls, and his brother is pulled from the Welland Canal with cement shoes. And Rocco Perri is the king of the bootleggers in Ontario. With Baroni out of the picture, bootlegging and illegal distilling of alcohol still continues here in Alice Street. His son, Thomas, takes over, but that doesn't mean the quarrel with Perri's over either. And Thomas wakes up one night to an explosion. TNT had been packed under his porch. Unbeknownst to them, however, the people who left it there, there was an old well under that porch at the back, and so when the TNT exploded, it actually fell down the well. So Thomas and his family were safe from both explosions. There was actually 2 timed bombs that went off trying to eliminate them. Now, this is Sacred Heart Catholic Church. It's built here in 1922 by the Italian community. And it's a pretty important structure during Guelph's Prohibition history, as the police would climb up here in the wintertime and use the roof as a vantage over the Alice Street and the ward community. Now, the police would use the roof of the church and the school. I'm at the top of the 100 stairs that are at the base of Elizabeth Street. And you get the idea. They are checking the rooftops for steam coming out of the chimneys, which would be a sign of a distillery, of the illegal production of alcohol. History is all around us. It's in our communities, it's in our neighborhood, it's on the street that we live. It's important to learn the stories of the past to understand the changes that they've brought and the significance and impact that they've had on our lives, and the narratives they've created for us as a people, as a community.